The little boy hadn't made a sound in 11 months. Not a word, not a laugh, not even a cry. His father had taken him to 3 specialists, 2 neurologists, and 1 therapist who charged $400 an hour and mostly just nodded. None of them could explain it. Theo Calloway, that was the boy's name, 6 years old, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn jaw, simply decided, somewhere between the funeral and the first frost of November, that the world didn't deserve his voice anymore. His father understood that more than he let on. Juniper Walsh had been working at Bright Steps Pediatric Therapy Center for 3 years when Theo Calloway walked through the door for the first time. She noticed him before she noticed his father. That was unusual. Most people noticed the father first. Nathaniel Calloway was 6'2", broad-shouldered in the way that suggested old money and older discipline, and he wore the kind of quiet authority that made hospital receptionists stand up straighter without knowing why. He was, as Juniper would later learn, the CEO of Calloway Infrastructure, a company that had built half the bridges in the Pacific Northwest. He was 38 years old. He had been a widower for 11 months. But Juniper noticed Theo first, because Theo was looking at the fish tank in the corner, a 60-gallon freshwater tank that Juniper herself had spent 2 weekends setting up, with an expression she had never seen on a 6-year-old. Not wonder, not boredom. Something in between, something that looked almost like recognition, like the fish were doing something only he understood. She crouched down beside him without thinking. "The orange one is named Biscuit," she said. "She thinks she's in charge, but she's actually just louder than everyone else." Theo didn't respond, but his eyes moved, just slightly, toward the clownfish hovering near the bottom of the tank. "That's Gerald," Juniper said. "He's shy. He's been here the longest, but he still hides behind the same piece of coral every single morning. Some days I think he just needs someone to convince him the water's safe." She wasn't looking at the boy when she said it. She was looking at the tank. Behind her, she heard the father exhale. It was a small sound, the kind of sound a person makes when they've been holding their breath for a very long time. Nathaniel Calloway had not wanted to come to Bright Steps. He had wanted to come to the other place, the one with the clinical white walls and the laminated certificates and the therapist who had written a book. His assistant had scheduled it twice. Twice, Theo had refused to get out of the car. The third time, they had driven past Bright Steps by accident, and Theo had pressed his face against the window and stared at the mural painted on the building's exterior, a sprawling scene of children and animals and improbably large flowers, with something that for just a second looked like interest. Nathaniel had pulled over. He wasn't a man who made decisions based on fish tanks and murals. He was a man who made decisions based on data, engineering reports, and quarterly projections. He had built a career on not being sentimental. But he had a 6-year-old boy who hadn't spoken in 11 months, and he was running out of things that made sense. Juniper Walsh was 31 years old and possessed, according to her colleague Petra, of an almost alarming ability to sit with uncomfortable silence. Most people, therapists included, felt compelled to fill silence, to offer reassurance, to probe gently, to move the session forward. Juniper just sat. She had learned, somewhere in her training and somewhere else in her actual life, that silence wasn't emptiness. It was a form of waiting. And some people, especially small people who had lost something enormous, needed someone willing to wait. She had been doing this long enough to know she was good at it. She was not, however, prepared for Nathaniel Calloway. He sat in the chair across from her desk during the initial intake consultation and answered every question with the precision of someone filing a report. Theo's age, medical history, the date of his mother's death. February 14th, which Juniper thought was the kind of cruelty that felt almost too on the nose, the date he had stopped speaking, the specialists they had seen, the therapies they had attempted. He spoke about his son the way engineers spoke about structural failures, clearly, factually, without ornament. "And how are you doing?" Juniper asked when he had finished. He looked at her as if she had asked him to solve an equation in a language he didn't recognize. "I'm here for my son," he said. "I know." She didn't look away. "I'm asking about you." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I'm functioning." Juniper wrote that down, not because it was clinically useful, because it was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in weeks. Theo came 3 times a week. Juniper didn't push him. She didn't implement structured protocols in the first 2 weeks. She let him move around the therapy room at his own pace, let him pick up objects and put them down, let him stare at things for as long as he needed to stare. She put music on sometimes. Not children's music, but soft instrumental things, piano and cello. And she narrated her own actions in a low, steady voice, the way you might talk to a cat you were trying not to startle. On the 8th session, Theo picked up a small stuffed rabbit from the basket in the corner. He held it for the rest of the hour without putting it down. Juniper considered that a breakthrough. She mentioned it to Nathaniel in the hallway afterward. He was standing by the window, looking at his phone, and when she said the word breakthrough, he looked up with an expression so carefully controlled it almost hid the hope behind it. Almost. He held a rabbit, he said. He chose it, Juniper said, out of a basket with 12 other options. He held on to it for 40 minutes. That's not nothing, Mr. Calloway. He looked at her for a moment, then he looked back at his phone. Nathaniel, he said. You can call me Nathaniel. She did not think about him on the drive home. That was what she told herself. She thought about Theo, which was professionally appropriate. She thought about the rabbit in the 40 minutes and what it might mean about readiness and attachment. She thought about the music she would try next week, and whether she should introduce art materials, and whether the fish tank needed its water changed. She did not think about the way he had said her name, Mrs. Walsh, when he'd signed the intake forms with the particular deliberateness of a person who'd been raised to be formal and wasn't sure how to stop. She didn't think about that at all. 6 weeks in, on a Wednesday afternoon in late January, Theo laughed. It was small. It was brief. Juniper had been doing something objectively ridiculous. She had been trying to demonstrate a hand puppet and had accidentally gotten her fingers tangled so badly that the puppet appeared to be having some kind of medical emergency. And Theo had looked up from the rabbit he was holding, and for exactly 3 seconds, he had laughed. It was the most beautiful sound Juniper had ever heard in her professional life. She kept her face very still, the way you keep still when a wild animal wanders close and you don't want to startle it. She untangled the puppet. She said very calmly, "Yeah, I think we've established that I'm better with fish than hand puppets." Theo looked back down at the rabbit, but the corner of his mouth was still lifted. She wrote it in his notes afterward, in her most clinical language, and then she sat for a moment in the empty therapy room and pressed her palm flat against the desk and breathed. In the hallway, Nathaniel was waiting the way he always waited, early, standing, phone in his hand but not looking at it. He looked up when she came out. He could read it on her face before she said a word. "What happened?" he asked. He laughed, she said. Nathaniel Calloway, CEO, structural engineer, a man who had built bridges across rivers that didn't want to be crossed, made a sound that Juniper would spend a long time trying not to remember too precisely. It wasn't grief and it wasn't joy, and it was completely both of those things. He turned away. He stood at the window for a moment with his hand pressed against the back of his neck. When he turned back, he had rearranged his face into something composed. "Over what?" he said. "A puppet malfunction," Juniper said. "I'm not proud of it." He looked at her for a moment. And then, quietly, briefly, Nathaniel Calloway smiled. His half-sister was named Cordelia, and she arrived in Nathaniel's life the way she always arrived, without warning and with opinions. Cordelia Ashworth was 34, impeccably dressed, and possessed of the specific brand of charisma that required an audience. She was not, as far as Juniper could tell from the stories that filtered through, from Petra, who had overheard a phone call in the parking lot, from the receptionist who had seen her in the lobby, a person who was comfortable being irrelevant. She had been irrelevant to Nathaniel's life for the past 11 months, while he navigated grief and single parenthood and whatever else went into being a man who had lost his wife and couldn't reach his son. Now that things were shifting, now that Theo had a therapist he didn't flee from, now that Nathaniel had started arriving at pickup looking fractionally less like a man who was holding himself together with structural engineering and willpower, Cordelia reappeared. Juniper met her once, briefly, in the parking lot. "You must be the miracle worker," Cordelia said, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Theo's therapist," Juniper said. "Of course," Cordelia tilted her head. "Nathaniel talks about you quite a bit." It was a small sentence. It was designed to do several things at once, and it did all of them. Juniper tried not to notice the things she was noticing. She tried not to notice that Nathaniel had started staying longer in the hallway after pickup. Not obtrusively. He always had a reason, always a question about Theo's progress, always something professionally appropriate. But the conversations had gotten longer. He had started asking things that weren't strictly clinical. What music she was using in sessions, whether she'd grown up in Portland or moved here, whether she liked the cold. She had started answering more than was strictly necessary. She told herself this was rapport building. She told herself that the relationship between a therapist and a parent required trust, and trust required human connection. And human connection sometimes looked like standing in a hallway on a Thursday evening talking about whether Pacific Northwest winters were a character-building experience or just a form of punishment. She told herself a lot of things. Her colleague Petra was less self-deceptive. "He brought you coffee," Petra said on a Tuesday in February. "It was for the whole office." He asked which one was yours. Juniper organized the files on her desk. "Petra," she said, "I'm just saying." What happened next came from Cordelia, because that was the kind of woman Cordelia was. Nathaniel had been pulling back from Cordelia's company for years. She had never approved of his late wife, had never approved of his choices, had made herself intermittently present in his life in the way of someone who wanted credit for involvement without the cost of actual closeness. He had kept her at a comfortable distance. He had managed her. But grief had loosened his boundaries in ways he hadn't entirely noticed, and Cordelia, who noticed everything, had noticed that. She came to him in early March with a story. She had, she said, seen Juniper having coffee with a man she identified with photographic evidence from a distance, as a consultant who worked with Meridian Child Development Group, one of Bright Step's direct competitors. "She's gathering information," Cordelia said. "I don't know what she's told you, or what access she's had to your files, or what she's been asking Theo, but you should consider what it would mean if the person treating your son had a conflict of interest." She didn't raise her voice. She never raised her voice. She just placed the photograph on the table between them and waited. The photograph showed Juniper Walsh seated at a coffee shop table across from a man in his 40s. They were talking. It was, on its face, exactly what Cordelia said it was. Nathaniel didn't cancel Theo's sessions. That, at least, said something about him. But he arrived the following Thursday different. Not cold. He was never cold, not with Theo. Contained. The hallway conversation that week lasted approximately 90 seconds. Juniper noticed. She noticed the way she had learned to notice things, without reacting, with a kind of steady attention that cataloged information and waited to understand it. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't push. But that evening, she went home and sat at her kitchen table and tried to figure out what had shifted and couldn't. Her friend Tamsin called. They had been close since graduate school, the kind of friend who knew when to be funny and when to shut up. And Juniper told her what she was thinking, which was that she had probably imagined the whole thing, the hallway conversations and the coffee and the specificity of his attention. And it was fine. And it was appropriate that it was ending, because she was Theo's therapist and Nathaniel was Theo's father, and there were very good reasons those lines existed. Or, Tamsin said, something happened and you don't know what it is yet. I don't have any reason to believe something happened. You have every reason to trust your instincts, Tamsin said. You've spent 3 years reading people who can't speak. Your instincts are excellent. The photograph was of Juniper and her older brother, Scott. Scott Walsh was 41 years old, a licensed speech-language pathologist and the director of professional development at Meridian Child Development Group. He was also profoundly deaf, had been since birth, and communicated through a combination of ASL and text, depending on context. The coffee shop meeting in the photograph was the third Thursday of every month, which was when Juniper and Scott had met for coffee for the past 9 years, through graduate school and career changes and the death of their mother 2 years ago. Because it was a thing they did, because he was her brother, because that was who he was in her life. She had never mentioned Scott at Bright Steps, not because she was hiding anything, but because her family was her own and it did not come up. She found out about the photograph from Petra, who had found out from the receptionist, who had overheard Cordelia in the lobby on a different day. Juniper sat with this information for 24 hours. Then she called Tamsin and said, something happened. She didn't go to Nathaniel. That was the first thing everyone would have told her to do, and she understood why, and she couldn't do it. Because there was something that felt like humiliation in explaining your own brother, in defending a coffee that needed no defense, in standing in front of a man who had, even briefly, even carefully, chosen to doubt her. What she did instead was not come back. She referred Theo's case to her colleague, Dr. Voss, formally, professionally, with detailed clinical notes. And she sent Nathaniel a letter explaining that due to a potential conflict of interest that had been raised, she was recusing herself from Theo's treatment and recommending a highly qualified colleague who would serve Theo well. She did not explain the conflict. She let him think what he wanted to think. It cost her more than she expected. Not the job, she had other clients. Bright Steps was understanding. It was professionally manageable. What cost her was Theo, the rabbit. The Tuesday session she had already planned around introducing watercolor. The small mouth that had lifted at the corner. She did not allow herself to sit with that cost for very long. Nathaniel found out the truth in the way people usually found out things they had failed to ask about. too late and from the wrong person. Cordelia had overplayed her hand, which was, Juniper later thought, perhaps the best thing that could have been said for her. She had mentioned the conflict of interest to one too many people, in the particular way of someone who wanted credit for protecting someone, and it had reached Petra, who had reached Dr. Voss, who had reached the director of Bright Steps, who had, quite calmly, asked Cordelia to explain what evidence she had, and who exactly she believed Juniper to be meeting. The coffee shop had a regular Thursday afternoon table. The man in the photograph had a name. The name belonged to a man who shared Juniper's last name, whose professional profile was publicly listed, and who was, unambiguously, her brother. Nathaniel learned all of this from Dr. Voss, standing in the hallway where he had stood every Tuesday and Thursday for 2.5 months, while Theo waited in the waiting room with a coloring book. He stood very still for a long moment. "She left because I let her think I believed it," he said. "I think," Dr. Voss said carefully, "that she left because no one asked her." The letter arrived at Juniper's apartment on a Saturday morning. Not an email, an actual letter, on actual paper, in handwriting that was the handwriting of an engineer, precise, slightly too formal, exactly evenly spaced. It said, "I owe you an explanation and an apology," in that order. "The explanation is that I was given information I should have questioned and didn't, because I am better at evaluating load-bearing capacity than I am at evaluating people who want something from me, and I have made this mistake before. I am not offering this as a defense. I am offering it because you deserved honesty and I gave you doubt instead. The apology is for that. For the doubt, for not asking, for making you explain yourself by making your absence speak for you instead. Theo asks for you. He doesn't say your name, he doesn't say anything yet. But he went back to the fish tank yesterday for the first time in 2 weeks and he looked at Gerald for a long time. I think he's waiting for the water to feel safe again. I think we both might be. If you're willing to speak with me, I would like that. Not about Theo's case, I understand that's closed and I understand why. About what I said to you, which is nothing, and that's exactly the problem." Nathaniel Calloway Juniper read it twice. She put it on her kitchen table and made coffee and stood at the window and watched the Saturday morning become a Saturday afternoon. Then she called Tamsin. "He wrote you a letter?" Tamsin said. "On paper, Juniper, I know, a paper letter, Tamsin. I'm just saying. That's a man who means it." She didn't respond to the letter immediately. She thought about it for 5 days, thought about it the way she thought about difficult cases, from multiple angles, sitting with discomfort without trying to resolve it prematurely. She was good at that. She had built a career on it. What she came back to, eventually, was something her mother had said once, when Juniper was in her early 20s and being careful in the particular way of someone who'd been burned and was trying to prevent it from happening again. Her mother had said, "Protecting yourself from everyone equally means you don't let anyone in at all." Her mother had been, as Tamsin would have put it, extremely correct. She met him for coffee on a Thursday. Not the coffee shop with Scott, somewhere different, a smaller place near the waterfront with wide windows and chairs that didn't match. She arrived first. She ordered tea, not coffee, because she was nervous and coffee would make it worse. Nathaniel arrived exactly on time. He was wearing a dark jacket and he didn't look like a CEO, and he didn't look like a widower, and he looked like a man who was nervous and was not entirely hiding it. He sat down. He didn't pick up the menu. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Thank you for the letter," she said. It was inadequate. It was honest. She looked at him. "You should know that the man in the photograph is my brother, Scott. He's been deaf since birth, which is actually what led me to work with children who need alternative communication approaches. We have coffee on the 3rd Thursday of every month. We've done it for 9 years. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Cordelia didn't know that," he said. "No." Juniper wrapped both hands around her mug. "But you didn't ask me." "I didn't ask you," he said. There was no deflection in it, no caveat. She appreciated that more than she expected to. "Why didn't you ask me?" she said. He considered the question seriously, the way he seemed to consider everything, not performing thought, actually doing it. "Because asking would have meant acknowledging that I cared enough for the answer to matter," he said. "And I wasn't prepared to admit that." The waterfront outside was gray and cold and very beautiful in the way Pacific Northwest winter mornings often were, which was accidentally and without apology. "What did Cordelia have to gain?" Juniper asked. Nathaniel exhaled. "Relevance. She doesn't like to be peripheral to my life, and she is." He paused. "She won't be in a position to do this again. I've been very clear about that." What did that look like? It looked like telling her, in writing, that her access to my household and my son is conditional on basic honesty, and that this was the second time she had violated that condition and there would not be a third. His jaw was set. If you're asking whether she faced legal consequences, I'm considering it. The therapist at Bright Steps mentioned defamation. Juniper thought of the comment she'd read once, months before. Sending her packing wasn't enough. She almost smiled. Good, she said. They talked for 2 hours. At some point, the gray morning became a gray afternoon, and the waterfront filled up and emptied slightly and filled again, and neither of them looked at their phones. He told her about the bridges he'd built. Not in a boastful way, in the way of someone who genuinely found their work meaningful and was slightly surprised to find themselves talking about it. She told him about Scott, about learning ASL as a teenager, about the way it had changed how she thought about language and silence and the many different ways a person could say something. He still doesn't speak, Nathaniel said about Theo, and there was no bitterness in it, just the fact. He will, Juniper said. Or he won't, and he'll find another way. But he's already communicating, Nathaniel, the rabbit, the fish, the corner of his mouth. She looked at him. He's not silent because he has nothing to say. He's silent because he hasn't decided yet whether the world is worth the risk. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. That's not only about Theo, he said. No, she said. It's not only about Theo. He asked if he could see her again. She said yes. She said it the way you say something when you've already been sitting with the decision for 5 days, and you know what it is. You've just been waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. She was not Theo's therapist anymore. That boundary was real, and she respected it, and she had referred him to someone excellent, and she would not blur it. What she was now was a woman sitting across from a man who had written her a letter on actual paper, and looked at her the way you look at someone when you are trying to understand them, and not just manage the impression they have of you. That was different. That was worth something. 3 months later, Bright Steps held its annual spring event, a small open house for families, with the fish tank and the art corner and Petra's legendarily excessive snack table. Nathaniel brought Theo. Theo walked in and went directly to the fish tank the way he always did. Gerald was in his usual spot behind the coral. The orange clownfish, Biscuit, was doing laps near the surface. Juniper was standing nearby talking to another family when she felt a small hand take hold of 2 fingers of her right hand. She looked down. Theo was looking at the fish tank. He was not looking at her, but he was holding her hand. And then, very quietly, in a voice that was smaller than she expected, and more certain than she feared, he said, "Gerald needs a friend." Juniper looked at the fish tank. She did not trust her face for a moment. She pressed her lips together and breathed. "You're right," she said. "I've been thinking the same thing." Nathaniel was standing across the room. He had gone still in the way of someone who had heard something they had stopped letting themselves hope for. His hand was at his side. He was not performing composure. He met her eyes over the top of his son's head, and he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The water, it turned out, had been safe all along. It had just taken the right person to say so.